Welcome, and today we've got a really fascinating story for you. It's a story of accidental creation. You see, over a span of 200 years, a series of laws were passed. But here's the thing, they weren't designed to build a nation, not at all. They were designed to solve a series of British problems. And yet somehow, they ended up creating the very framework for modern India's government.
So, let's start with a puzzle, shall we? This story, it doesn't begin with grand declarations or revolutionaries. It begins with the East India Company. We're talking about a private corporation that sailed to India way back in the 1600s with one simple goal: trade. Spices, cotton, tea, that was the plan. Their goal was profit, pure and simple, not politics. So how on earth did they end up as rulers? Well, the whole game changed in 1765. After a huge victory at the Battle of Buxar, the Mughal emperor, who was pretty weakened by this point, granted the company what were called Diwani rights. Now this was the golden ticket. It meant the company could collect all the taxes from a massive, super wealthy territory. The emperor was still the face of the government, he had to deal with all the problems, but the company got all the cash. It was a brilliant setup, and it's the moment they went from being just traders to a real territorial power.
Okay, so back in London, Parliament suddenly has this massive headache. Company employees are coming back from India with just obscene amounts of wealth. Stories of corruption, of bribery, of abuse of power are everywhere. You've got this private British company acting like a rogue state thousands of miles away, and Parliament realizes it has to step in. And this is key, not to govern India, but to get a handle on its own out-of-control corporation.
So this kicks off the first phase of our story. For the next 80 years or so, the British Parliament is basically going to try to put a leash on the East India Company. They pass a whole series of acts, all trying to regulate this giant corporation from halfway across the world.
Their first big attempt was the Regulating Act of 1773. To try and centralize things, they made the Governor of Bengal, a guy named Lord Warren Hastings, the Governor-General over the other big territories. To get some legal oversight, they set up a brand new Supreme Court. And to deal with all that corruption, they flat out banned employees from doing their own private trading or taking bribes, which they called presents.
The next big law, Pitt's India Act, created this weird kind of split personality for the company's rule. You can see it in the table. On one hand, you have a new government-appointed board of control. They handled all the important stuff, politics, the military, you name it. On the other hand, the company's own directors were left to manage the commercial side of things. This was a huge deal because for the first time, the British government had ultimate control, even though it was still using the company as its instrument. And this system of dual control, of indirect rule, it just kind of rumbled along for decades. The company kept expanding, fighting wars, running huge parts of India, all while technically being a private business on a government leash. But then came 1857. The Great Revolt, what's known in India as the First War of Independence, erupted, and it completely shattered this entire arrangement. The revolt was just this brutal, bloody conflict that shook the British Empire to its very core. The whole idea of ruling a subcontinent through a private company suddenly seemed impossible. The reluctant architect, Britain, had to step out from behind the curtain. It was time to take direct imperial control of its jewel in the crown.
And that led to the Government of India Act of 1858, which was a total reset. The East India Company? Gone. Dissolved. All of its territories and powers were transferred directly to the British Crown. The Governor-General got a new title, Viceroy, making him the direct representative of the Queen. And a whole new cabinet position was created in London to oversee it all. The company era was officially over. The British Raj had begun.
You know, that 1857 revolt taught the British a really harsh lesson. You can't rule a place like India in a vacuum, completely ignorant of what the people are thinking and feeling. This led to a big strategic shift. To avoid another massive uprising, they decided they needed to bring Indians into the process of governing, even if it was in a really, really limited advisory way. And that first, tiny step came with the Indian Councils Act of 1861. It basically allowed the viceroy to nominate a few prominent Indians to his council as non-official members. But let's be totally clear about what non-official meant. It meant they could give their opinions, but they had no vote. This wasn't about sharing power. It was about having a finger on the pulse, about listening in.
Right. So as we move into the 20th century,
Indian nationalism is getting much more organized, much more vocal. And the British response is a series of reforms that were designed to do two things at once: give just enough representation to quiet things down, but also to try and divide and manage the growing independence movement.
The Marley-Minto reforms of 1909 introduced a concept that would have massive consequences: separate electorates. This system, first brought in from Muslims, meant that in certain areas only Muslim voters could vote for Muslim candidates. Now, the argument was that this guaranteed minority representation, but what it also did was legally build religious division right into the political structure, a legacy that would echo for decades.
The next big move was the Act of 1919, which brought in this really complicated system called diarchy. Yeah, I know it's a weird word, but basically it divided up government departments into two lists. The transferred subjects, things like education and health, were put under the control of Indian ministers. But the really important reserved subjects, we're talking finance, the police, law and order, were kept firmly in the hands of the British governor. It was another step for sure, but a step with some very crucial safety switches.
And this chart, wow, this really tells the story of just how slow and restrictive that path was. Look at the growth of the number of people who could vote. Even after all these reforms, by 1935, the right to vote was still limited by things like how much property you owned or how much tax you paid. We're only talking about roughly 10% of the entire population.
Okay, so this brings us to the final, and honestly the most significant piece of British legislation for India. By the 1930s, the call for independence was just unstoppable. So the British government made one last, massive attempt to create a workable framework. And ironically, it ended up becoming the blueprint for the very nation that was about to replace them.
This was the Government of India Act of 1935, and it was a beast. It was the longest, most detailed piece of legislation the British Parliament had ever passed. The whole goal was to create this federal structure that would keep India inside the British Empire. But it was so comprehensive that it accidentally handed India's future leaders the entire structural skeleton for their own constitution.
And what's so wild is how many of these features are instantly recognizable today because they were pretty much lifted and adopted wholesale. The idea of dividing powers into federal, provincial, and concurrent lists, that's from this act. The federal court that became the Supreme Court? Yep. Even the Reserve Bank of India. All of these core pieces of modern India were laid out right here in this one British Act. The blueprint was all there.
The years that followed that 1935 act were just a whirlwind. You had World War II, intense political negotiations, and constant pressure. In the end, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 didn't actually create a new government from scratch. It simply transferred power to two new dominions, India and Pakistan, who would then, for the most part, adopt the framework that had been built piece by painful piece over the last century.
So, when you boil it all down, the vast machinery of India's government, its parliamentary system, its civil services, its legal courts, it wasn't born in a single moment of revolutionary fire. It evolved, slowly, over 2 centuries of reactive, often reluctant laws passed by a foreign power trying to solve its own problems. And it leaves us with one final, big question. How much of that accidental architecture, built for an empire, still shapes the everyday functions of the world's largest democracy today?